and welcome to another video. And today is the 8th February, and today we have some important updates from the Donbass front. And so I'm going to spend the entire video just trying to talk about the recent updates from this area. I'm going to first start off with Marinka, but then I'm going to go to Bakhmut and to the just general vicinity of Bakhmut, also looking at some of the areas to the north of Bakhmut. But let's start out with Marinka first. Okay, in Marinka, we have finally seen some changes to the map, although they're not significant. We now have Russia advancing along two different directions in Marinka. First of all, they're advancing from the north, where they crossed the Druzhby Avenue. And Druzhby Avenue, if you go up north enough, then you have a road that leads into Krasnohorivka. And so, at least in that regard, it is important as a supply route. But given the fact that Russia has been able to cut it off, they're not using that, obviously. They're either going to have to go around a full roundabout course through Hivka and then go to Marinka to supply Krasnohorivka, or vice versa. Or they would have to go through this smaller road locally and reach the northern part of Marinka. Although Russia probably has fire control over a lot of the road at the moment because of their positions in these apartment buildings that are pretty close to Druzhby Avenue in the eastern road to Krasnohorivka. But if we're looking at the front line, we see that the Russians were able to cross over the main dividing line of Marinka, and they were able to take control of some of the residential areas that are in the northern district of Marinka. Now, this is significant because you have a lot of Ukrainian fortifications in these Ukrainian strongholds. You have agricultural enterprises. You have this church, this Orthodox church, which was turned into a Ukrainian stronghold. There are a lot of barracks over here, a lot of stations for field artillery, mortars, ammo dumps, all of that. You also have some trenches and other such fortifications. And so this entire area in northern Marinka is pretty fortified. If the Russians could take it over, it would be good, because then they could flank the rest of the grouping in Marinka from the north, where you do probably have a more dense troop concentration because of all the different houses and apartment buildings that are over there that can be used to station troops. And that's really where you're seeing most of the fighting going on at the moment. And so it could take the Ukrainians, and specifically the 79th Brigade, off guard if they're attacked from the north. And at the same time, the Russians are attacking from the south. So they have advanced to the west across Druzhby Avenue in this direction, and they were able to take over at least part of the agricultural enterprise in this region. And so there's fighting over there at the moment where they're trying to consolidate control over the rest of the agricultural enterprise. And then from there, they're going to be able to advance through this road and through this road to attack Marinka from the south. And because Ukraine has been focusing the vast majority of their efforts on preventing a Russian frontal assault over here, then again, they might be caught off guard by a concurrent Russian assault from the south. So you're seeing how from both sides there are attacks going on at the moment, and it could lead to potentially the Ukrainian grouping in Marinka having to withdraw from several of these blocks. Now, Ukraine only has a few more positions to the east of Druzhby Avenue. They really only have control of the administrative building and a few other houses over here. But if you look at drone footage, you will see that basically every single house is leveled due to the years-long fighting, and Ukrainian troops are hiding at the moment in the ruins, while Russian tanks are trying to clear them out one by one from each house. There actually is some footage of this, of a Russian tank targeting the Ukrainian forces in a grocery store. It doesn't look like a grocery store anymore. It's just like a desolate wasteland at this point. But one of the reasons why Marinka has been able to hold on for so long is because the 79th Air Assault Brigade has been supplied through this town, Kurokove, where it's not just an artillery hub where a lot of artillery is stationed that's then fired into the Vuhledar direction and into the Donetsk direction, but it's also a rail, or not rail anymore, but a road junction that leads into different key points on the front line It's one of the key junctions leading into Vuhledar, for instance. So in that regard, it's very important. But then it also branches out into Marinka. You can see how the chain of towns from Korkove leads into Marinka. And this road is not exposed at the moment. So it could be continued. It could continue to be in use by the Ukrainians. And so they could be resupplied, and more men could be sent to the front line to patch any holes if Russia's able to develop and sort of continue with their current offensive operations, which again aren't that significant, but we are seeing the first progress in Marinka in really many months ever since they were able to take the first eastern outskirts of the town a while ago. So if we go up now to the Bakhmut direction, I'm going to talk about some of the updates from here. Ivanivske, the Wagner group, has basically reached the T0504 road. I don't know if they have like a physical presence on the road, but again, it doesn't really matter. What matters more is that now they have positions just to the southwest of Ivanivske, and that they are continuing to advance to the southeast of Ivanivske and just to the south directly of Ivanivske. So you see how Ivanivske is being slowly enveloped, and that it will create a lot of difficulties for the Ukrainian grouping in Ivanivske, which will be overwhelmed if it's attacked from all sides. You do have on the southwestern, or just more on the western side, this chalk quarry. You have a lot of different hedgerows, different smaller ponds, abandoned mine shafts, and other such structures in this area. And then to the south, you have these warehouses for agriculture. So all of these are being used by the Ukrainians as defensive fortifications, but the town isn't that large, and they haven't had that much time to prepare for the impending Russian assault on Ivanivske, which will make attacking it easier for the Wagner group, especially given the fact that if you look at the elevation map over here, here is Ivanivske. It is on a very low elevation, so in that regard, there's not much of an issue taking it. But if you just go a bit more to the west, you'll see that the entire line around Chasiv, and the line around Chasiv that I'm referring to is the water canal. Here's the water canal. You can see how it's running through all of this high elevation. So it makes attacking the line that I'm going over in red very difficult. So this might become the new Ukrainian defensive line, especially if the situation in Bakhmut goes awry. And given the fact that it's at such a high elevation, because it really is, it's maybe at like 220, 230 meters in some cases, maybe even higher, 250, 260, compared to the elevation in a place like Ivanivske or Bakhmut, where it's only like 120. That's a massive difference, and it makes the entire fight around the water canal literally an uphill battle for the Russians. And so, as a natural barrier, the line around Chasiv is very effective. So the Ukrainians are already preparing defensive fortifications in Chasiv, and they could use the geographic elements like forests and ravines to their advantage. Just something that I expect them to do as we approach the battles in Chasiv. But at the meantime, we're still experiencing the battles in Bakhmut. Although there are some new developments, the Wagner group has been able to reach the Bakhmutovka River. Now we're going to see if they cross it. And they have crossed it, at least in one area that I've talked about before. I talked about how they were able to take over the garden center. And then using this foothold in the garden center, they were able to advance towards the northern parts of the Stupki district, which is the northernmost district of Bakhmut. So using these positions, they have now been able to take over a tire shop and a smog inspection station. And at this point, they're virtually right next to these two bridges over here that I do believe are destroyed, but either way, they were used as roads and paths that would supply the Ukrainian garrison in Bakhmut, although I don't believe that was happening for a very long time. And so taking these bridges now doesn't really mean much of anything. In fact, it is possible that Ukraine even destroyed them because they were anticipating the Russians that would be coming in, and they didn't want the Russians to utilize these bridges. But either way, the Russians have been able to effectively cut off the communication between the groupings in Paraskoviivka and Bakhmut, which is an issue. because if you look at Paraskoviivka, it is being enveloped at the moment. So I'm going to get to that in a second. But you see how the E40 road, it does intersect with this these few roads over here, and then they go down south to Bakhmut. So now, effectively, the only routes into Bakhmut, besides the Hromove one, are just like some minor roads from Berkivka. But I don't know how the Ukrainians will be able to deliver supplies effectively through here if the Russians continue their advance towards Paraskoviivka. So speaking of Paraskoviivka, you can see how it's being attacked now from three different sides. First of all, we have from the south, where the Russians have gained a foothold in the Stupki district, where they have been able to take over more than 2 blocks. They are beginning to engage the Ukrainian positions in the southern outskirts of the town, so that's where you're seeing fighting, although Ukraine is still holding the line. Same thing in Krasnohora. Here you have a mini encirclement that is taking place. The Ukrainians are holding on in Krasnohora because they want to extend the fighting over there for as long as possible in order to prevent a wider encirclement. And so in that regard, they've been effective because the eastern flank, or the eastern side axis of the fighting, has remained pretty far away from Paraskoviivka due to the Ukrainian resistance in Krasnohora, which makes it more difficult to take Paraskoviivka when you zoom out. But we are seeing more and more clashes, especially from the south, and Russia has already made some gains in the south where they took over some of the factories that could be used to overlook the residential areas. So yeah, the situation in Krasnohora is difficult. A lot of casualties incurred by the Ukrainian side, but they are holding on. To the north, you have the Russians using their positions in Blahodatne that were just taken, trying to attack the northern outskirts of the town, where you again have another agricultural area. I would say the front line is basically around this pond right now, and so the Russians have not been able to enter the city or town itself. But you see how they were able to take over a lot of the open fields just to the west of Blahodatne. And using these positions, which are on a higher elevation, I will open the elevation map in a second, but using these positions, they are going to be able to, first of all, reach the E40 highway, which could, in theory, still supply Paraskoviivka. And then they could either attack Berkivka, which would cut off, again, that road that I was talking about to Bakhmut, or they could try to encircle the Paraskoviivka garrison by linking up with the garrison in Stupki. And so this is assuming that Ukraine would not react in any way. They probably would, and they would probably retreat before this happened. But either way, it would force Ukraine's hand into leaving Paraskoviivka, which would create a very strong Russian flank that could be used to assault Bakhmut from the north. So we would see a lot of pressure being applied to the Ukrainian groupings in the Yahidny and Hromove if that were to happen. If we go to the elevation map and we zoom in, we could see that going to the area in Blahodatne that I was just referring to, you see that Russia now has control over these open fields in between the two ridges. So you have this ridge over here, which is where the front line is currently situated at, and then you have this other ridge over here where the front line used to be at. Like it's connecting the Blahodatne river, town of Blahodatne and Bakhmutovka river to the E40 highway. So these two ridges, Russia has control of the fields in between them, which are in a high elevation, maybe like 170, 180, 190 meters above sea level. And those overlook Krasnohora, they look over Paraskoviivka, they look over Berkivka, although there is another set of higher elevation areas just to the south that are still under Ukrainian control. Those could be attacked now by the Russians. So you'll be able to have like forward observation posts for the Russians where they could fire mortars, or they could pinpoint Ukrainian positions, and those could be fired upon by Russian artillery that's farther away. So that's the issue with losing the high ground. If we go to the entire Blahodatne sector, the Russians have been able to take over these main Ukrainian defensive fortifications, which were holding out for about 2 weeks ever since the fall of Soledar and the Sil train station. The Ukrainians were able to build trenches, zigzag trenches, around this just defensive line just to the west of the road that leads from Siversk to Bakhmut. Now they've been forced to retreat, though, because of continuous Russian pressure and due to the fact that the Russians were beginning to envelop the defensive fortifications from both the south and the north. So now the front line has moved to this ridge that I was just talking about, which is around the town of Zalazhnyanske, which is very small. Once the Russians reach it, they could be able to take it in like a matter of hours because of just how small it is. It is just a few agricultural enterprises and a few houses. But you do have some formidable units, Ukrainian military, that have experience from Soledar and from the fighting in the defensive fortifications that are still in this area. So they're trying to regroup right now. The Russians are also trying to assault Vasyukivka, although I have not been able to find any information about Russian gains just yet. Although I would look out for the situation over here, because if you, again, look at the elevation map, you'll see that this town, Vasyukivka, and all of the towns that are along the road that goes through Vasyukivka are in a low elevation, so I expect the Russians to try to take it over, so they are able to get control over these supply lines, and they're able to then create an opportunity to assault all of the rural towns south of Siversk. Again, you could see how the Ukrainians are probably setting up some new defenses around the high ground over here, which is just to the west of the current ridge that is the front line. So you could see fighting going on over here as the Ukrainians try to prevent a further Russian breakthrough to reach the main Ukrainian line that I was hypothesizing about, that is around this water canal. Now, let's move on to the situation in Spirny, because there is a lot of ambiguity as to what's going on over here. So I heard from some Russian sources that they were able to take over the entirety of Spirny. I don't believe this is correct. A lot of Russian sources came out and clarified the situation, and they say that it is still contested, although the Russians were conducting some offensive operations to the south. They were able to take over some of the open fields and the trenches and the hedgerows just to the south of Spirny. But despite that fact, the Russians have not been able to take the full control of the town, although they may have control over this gas compression sector over here. But besides that, the Ukrainians are still holding. Taking Spirny would allow the Russians to take over Ivano-Darivka and the fortifications to the west of it, and again, it would allow the Russians to reach Siversk from the south. So that is another issue for Russia, for Ukraine, if they're going to lose Spirny, which is why they're trying to invest so much effort into preventing that from occurring. Same thing with Blahodatne. The Ukrainians are still holding on. The situation is very difficult, but the Russians are conducting numerous assaults. None have been able to push the Ukrainians out of the town for now. And so a lot of the Russian sources that originally claimed that it was under their control are now sort of backtracking because there was no proof of this. There were some rumors that the Russians were assaulting Paraskoviivka and Serebrenka. And if that is the case, then maybe the Russians were like conducting some sort of probing attacks from the north, or maybe they have some positions that are a bit more forward than I have drawn on the map, and then they're attacking Serebrenka and Paraskoviivka from the south along this higher elevation area just to the north of Verkhovno-Kamyanske. So you do have a hill over here, and this hilly area, maybe like 200 meters in height, does give really a good view of the surrounding area and the valleys like in Siversk or in Blahodatne. And so taking control of these hills is very important in order to have like regional domination, and it's part of the reason why the Russians were not able to assault Siversk in the first place during the summer, and they were forced to retreat back into the Luhansk region. So I do want to talk about the Luhansk region in a different video, specifically about the Crimea and Kupiansk fronts, but I don't have time to get into that today. I will do that in the next video. But in terms of what happened today, I went over everything that was significant. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.